Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
This programme has been edited since broadcast.
Hello. Sadly, it's all too obvious that human rights aren't equally enjoyed across the world. But could they ever be? Or is the great missionary enterprise of the last 50 years losing its impetus in a changing world? You aren't really meant to question human rights as a concept, but Stephen Hopgood, reader in international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, has dared to in his book The Endtimes of Human Rights. Bianca Jagger will be pushing back against his scepticism, I think, as chair of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation and as a tireless campaigner for basic human rights to be recognised by governments everywhere. Also with us, offering another take on the perpetual friction between local and global values, the writer Fatima Bhutto, whose novel The Shadow of the Crescent is set in a troubled region of Pakistan, and Howard Brenton, whose new play is about one of the reasons it ended up so troubled, British rule in India and its messy and bloody conclusion. We start, though, with Bianca Jagger, who's just delivered this year's Longford Lecture in London, a passionate appeal for the world to take violence against women more seriously than it has done so far. Bianca, your lecture is subtitled Achieving the Missing Millennium Development Goal Target. Why missing? There is the third Millennium Development Goal target is to promote gender equality and empower women. Doesn't that cover what you're...
Well, in the Millennium Development Goals that they set out in the year 2000, they left out ending violence against women, and UN Women calls that the missing Millennium Development Goal. And I've been...
And that's not... but why is that not covered by gender equality and empowerment? Well,
because that's something else. It's not one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. That is covered, but it's not specific to the Millennium Development Goals. And therefore, I was quite shocked to find that they didn't think that was an important target, and that they are discussing that they will introduce it in 2015. But I feel that we have no time to wait for another 2 years. And, many people think that violence against women is an issue that concerned only the developing world. But that is not so. And I tried to explain that in my lecture, because the numbers in this country, for example, 400,000 women suffer sexual assault. There were 60,000 rapes in the UK last year. Only 1 in 10 women are prepared to denounce the rapes, and only over 5,000 were prosecuted. That means that even if we have laws, that those laws are not enforced, and that something is wrong, even in the developed world.
I mean, is your point as well that unless you solve this problem first, you're not going to be able to solve the other?
Well, my point is that if we don't solve this, then many of those targets, that will not be able to develop, particularly when we talk about development, and that is such an important issue. And why is it that at this stage in the 21st century, after so many years, we're still dealing with these horrendous numbers of women that have been raped, of women that have been victims of sexual assault, of women that have been killed by the partner? This morning I was listening to the numbers of women that were killed last year in the UK by the partners. I mean, it is unthinkable, but it is. It is unspoken, underhanded, but they still believe that women are inferior.
You're very persuasive about the fact that something has to be done. Your lecture is depressing, which might sound like an insult, but it's meant to be depressing. It's a litany of terrible statistics. It's less clear what we do about it. What practical action can you take beyond calling for action?
Well, in fact, the lecture maybe that you saw was the one that I gave at Oxford University, and that I gave in America. But the one I gave at the Longford lecture, I did give some examples of my vision and what we can do and why it is so important to have this legal mechanism to be able to make a difference. And they are, we need to reform the laws, and then I went in details about some of the laws that we need to reform. We need, of course, to engage governments. We need to engage the police. We need to engage, NGOs. We need to engage as well the religious leaders. Because
you run into a problem, though, don't you, almost immediately? I mean, the 2013 Commission on the Status of Women, Russia, the Vatican and the Muslim Brotherhood came together in this unlikely alliance to block certain statements.
And that is what is so scary. And then I hope that perhaps now, with our new Pope, that things will be a bit different for the Catholic Church.
But you are reliant on goodwill, as it were, because what else do you have to trump that resistance?
Well, unfortunately, all we have is the goodwill. But what I did in my speech is that I call upon women to declare a non-violence revolution. But I didn't only call upon women to declare a non-violence revolution to achieve this, but I call upon men as well, because we cannot achieve the ending violence against women and girls and the culture of impunity unless men are prepared to join in with us in this struggle.
Stephen Hopgood, I want to bring you in now, because your book, The Endtimes of Human Rights, is very specifically about some of these issues and about the practicality of applying a universal set of values, a universal notion of human rights for women to very different societies. I mean, I wonder, are you essentially saying that Bianca is wasting her time in this enterprise?
I don't think she's necessarily wasting her time, but I agree with much of her analysis. What I am is more sceptical than she is that human rights are going to be an effective mechanism for making change happen. If you look globally, it seems to me there's pushback from the religious organisations you mentioned, authoritarian nationalism. My central point is that the sort of Western powers which have supported the international human rights regime for, in some ways, 150 years are declining in their influence. And so a new settlement will have to be achieved, and it's not going to be good news for the hard cases, women's rights, sexuality rights, children's rights in many, many parts of the world.
You make a distinction between human rights with capital letters and human rights with lowercase letters. Could you just explain a little bit
Lowercase
why?
Human rights are the sort of claims we'd all make for equality, freedom, dignity, fair treatment. It can't be the end times for human rights like that. Human rights with capital H, capital R are the global institutions, the obsession with international law that doesn't work, and the creating of an international criminal court and the idea of the responsibility to protect, which is all about large-scale grandstanding by Western human rights advocates and isn't really going to deliver any meaningful change in the communities
is
where
your
it matters.
objection to those simply practical, or is there a moral objection to them, to as a kind of... I mean, there's a little sense in your book that it's a new form of imperialism, a new form of missionary work.
The arrogance of global human rights advocates who spend a lot of time telling us that they're making a real difference in people's lives. But when you look at the way people live in communities throughout the developing world particularly, it's not obvious any of that trickles down. I mean, one example I'd stress is many people in the developing world want the right to food as a primary right, and that's one of the things that they push. But no global human rights organisation is interested in the right to food.
I am. I'm sorry, and I'm not the only one. There are many, and I will say I agree with some of the things that you said and some of the things you say in your book. But what I would like to say is the fact that some of what you mentioned is failing, and that there is a failure at the heart of some of those institutions, doesn't mean that we need to accept it. We have to struggle. We have to continue, demanding from governments, from institutions, that they adhere to those international human rights principles. That I agree with you in many of the things you say in your book. I read carefully about that. But we can't. I mean, I am someone who believes that we can make a difference.
And I think we can make a difference, but whether global human rights law is the way to do it, as you demonstrate very effectively, it's failed in all sorts of ways. I think when you talk about non-violent resistance movements, particularly the increasing number of women-led non-violent resistance movements, large numbers of people in motion exerting leverage, I think that's likely to be much more effective. But it's not clear that's what the global human rights organisations, courts, law has in mind.
Howard Brenton.
Well, all institutions can be corrupt, and, officials can go and spend too much money on fancy hotels, and it may be imperfect. But I was thinking just in practical terms that a charity, although it's not actually a human rights organisation, but a charity like Freedom from Torture, or the Israeli B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organisation, which tries to engage with Palestinian, abuses against Palestinians. Is it better for them that there is an attempt at a universal legal structure and a universal expression of human rights, or is it hindering them? I'd have thought it was helping them.
In many cases it helps, but in the majority of cases it's often a hindrance. When you deal, for example, with communities of faith, bringing in the global human rights language, very individualised, very legalised, very westernised, is immediately creates resistance. So speaking a language which people of faith can engage with, but isn't that very, very monotheistic global human rights language, may well be more effective in.
But are you saying a very harsh thing then, that in some cases you simply have to kind of surrender one desirable goal to achieve a larger one?
Well,
it's a Benthamite calculation that maybe, gay men in Russia have to be beaten up because you're going to lose something bigger. I mean, that sounds appalling to say.
I wouldn't put it that way at all. But the best way to help gay men in Russia may not be more international law. It may well be other forms of activism and trying to assist them in other kinds of ways that don't necessarily just emphasise human rights.
I want to bring Fatima Bhutto in.
We have, in the case of Pakistan, I'm not sure the global structures are that helpful. It's these smaller groups, it's local activism, it's women like Malala, for example, who lead struggles.
But Malala has been rejected in Pakistan.
Malala has been treated extraordinarily unfairly by a segment of Pakistani population. Absolutely. The response she has gotten is shameful from her country.
Bianca, I want to say something. Yes, I agree that it's very important to have grassroots organizations, but we cannot deny the great B'Tselem is an example of an extraordinary organization that does extraordinary under tremendous hardship in Israel. But Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all these organizations that have made tremendous change in the world. And I know that the ICC may have some problems, but it is a great institution that needs to be reformed. It needs to be better funded. It needs to be more effective.
I want to come back to that, actually, because you talk a lot about the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And, I mean, your point is that the attempt to get a universal legal system is doomed and is only supported when you have a superpower promoting it as part of its foreign policy. It's effectively, for a long time, the Americans thought that was a rather useful thing to have. And we're now moving into a world that is no longer the case. Could you just explain what you mean by the post-Westphalian world, which you talk about in your book?
That the rules, global human rights rules, much international law, were written in a system which, first of all, the Europeans and then the United States were the dominant powers within, and that there's a permanent structural decline in their influence. So countries like China, India, Brazil and Indonesia, they're subject to a system with rules they didn't write and increasingly are pushing back. Russia's had renewed vigour because China's created an alliance that will empower it. They want to rewrite some of those rules. They want to push back. So national sovereignty for countries like China is extremely important. And if China stresses its national sovereignty against international human rights, then this creates a sort of beacon or focal point for resistance to other kinds of international human rights norms. So the window is closing effectively, and you see that in the Commission on the Status of Women you mentioned and in other areas, pushback against human rights.
Now that's a description of a depressing landscape. Does it necessarily have to be the case? What's the best thing to do if we accept you're right, it's failing? What do we do now?
Well, what we do, as in we within Britain, is one thing. What people who live in situations of extreme human rights abuse do is something else. They may well find that they organise themselves. more solidarity, more funding for solidarity organisations, more political leverage against
I'm a bit
governments,
sceptical
things
about
like
how
that.
this works, though. I want to go back to the gay teenager in Russia, who your argument, I think, I don't want to kind of see it falsely, would be external pressure, external humiliation of Russia, the imposition of a liberal set of values is counterproductive.
Yes.
So, how then do you stop young gay Russian teenagers getting beaten up, if that is something that troubles you?
Well, what gay Russian... Of course it's something that troubles me. It should trouble us all. But what gay Russian teenagers will need to do is organise within the structures within which they live. They might work within the church. They might work within other organisations to try to get more sort of social change within their own communities.
Fatima Bhutto, you're nodding,
Yeah.
right?
Well, in the case of Pakistan suffered a barbarous military dictatorship in the 1980s, and General Zia-ul-Haq, who ruled the country with an iron fist, had put into place a number of horrific laws, including the blasphemy law, including very brutal laws against women. And one of the things he had decided was that the punishment for thieves was to be the amputation of the hands. Now, we know this has been used in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, and it's been carried out and practiced. When Zia-ul-Haq put this law in place, it was not Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or Pakistan's own human rights bodies that did anything about this. Rather, it was doctors all across the country that refused to carry out a single amputation that saved people from this barbarous sort of punishment. So I agree very much with Stephen. It has to come from these grassroots mobilization of people who band together against violations.
Can I put back to you and to Bianca, in fact, a hard case against that, when the Pakistani government outlawed public whipping for crimes,
Yes.
It left on the statute book
Yes.
the punishment of being publicly whipped for adultery, even if you were raped.
Well, so
Now, how do you go about if the doctors themselves are not going to?
Well, it comes back to what Bianca said. In 1996, the Pakistani government repealed a law that mandated whipping for convicts. However, they didn't touch the Hudud ordinances, which essentially criminalize a victim of rape in Pakistan on the grounds that if she's married and has been raped, she's basically committed adultery. If she is not married and has been raped, she's engaged in premarital sex. They left that as it were. So in Pakistan today, women are the only convicts that may still be whipped. So when Bianca talks about a non-violent movement of women, this is what we need. We need more voices of Pakistani women, of women around the world. Women like Malala who come out and speak against the violence that they face every day. I'm not sure international bodies have done anything in that regard.
They haven't, but might they not draw succour from the sense that there is an international notion of justice or an international notion of human rights?
But I'm all for organizations at the grassroots level. It only can work if it is that way. But of course you need international support for those organizations as well. And there is something very important that you said, which is, I think what you touched on, which I agree deeply with you, is the double standards of human rights. It is called universal. Universal human right. And that's what it's not. For example, why African countries say, why are they trying, African leaders who committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, but we are not trying George Bush? And that is a very serious and important question. Why is it that we are not applying the same standards to the developed world, to the powerful countries, than the one we apply to the developing countries? And
Stephen Hopgood, isn't that a central point of your arraignment? That
Yes.
in fact that never has been done, never will be done?
Yes, it's impossible that any major leader of a powerful state will appear before the ICC. In fact, the major states haven't joined the ICC. China and the United States and India will see it as a badge of great power that you don't have to join the ICC.
Well, states do not like human rights, and that doesn't mean that the idea of a universal human right is therefore wrong, because states resist them. It's people, as we've been saying, at the grassroots, on the ground, who need... But isn't it true that ideas in the end change reality? And that the ideas are there and they have been expressed universally. It's hard to say which of the 30 articles of the Declaration of Human Rights do you think is wrong?
But
it's there, and the ideas. Sorry,
You
this is
don't
weird. I know I'm
think
being.
it's-
I don't
you
think they're
think
wrong.
But you are scornful. You talk at one point about human rights as a luxury good for the urban middle class. So it's a notion that it is something that's consoling to us who mostly have our rights, and is kind of placating.
I think that's the way that many people see rights. Much contemporary activism, which is about signing an online petition, isn't really going to make a big difference to the lives of real people. But expanding middle classes have their luxury goods, and a human rights organisation or a human rights chapter is...
Bianca,
is
Jagger, I know you feel that Twitter is a real
I
force. but-
disagree. Those petitions make a difference. When you have millions of people who sign on to something and you present that to a government, it makes a difference. I mean, when I get on Twitter... a petition from, not a petition, a woman from, who lived in Fukushima and who writes to me and she say, please, the media is not paying attention to this issue. Can you please, write something about that? And those women were the ones who made mainstream media paid attention to what's happening in Japan and how the government was concealing and hiding the real truth about Fukushima.
Fatima Bhutto, I want to turn to you in your novel now, because you're writing about a region which is so far outside this, one internet cafe, I think, in your novel, but only reachable by certain people. Just tell us, why did you set it in that particular region of Pakistan?
Well, The Shadow of the Crescent Moon is set in Waziristan, in the tribal regions of Pakistan. And I think when it comes to Pakistan, people have a very singular idea of what Pakistan means. The media has presented it in really shades of black and white, and we look at big words like terror or suicide bombings. We never really look at people. We never really look at how people struggle against violence perpetuated by the state, by other groups. We never look at how they struggle, and essential to my novel is the struggle of women. Millions and millions of women in South Asia, not just Pakistan, suffer the oppression of so many forces, whether it's political or societal or familial. But they struggle and they fight back. This is a region of warriors. You have to be a warrior to be a woman in Pakistan to survive.
You have two very strong women in your novel, Meena and Samara, but they are... we come at them through three men.
Yes.
We see them first through the men's eyes, and that's our angle. Why did you do it that way round? Is it because that's the reality on the ground?
I think so. I think it is. And when I started writing The Shadow of the Crescent Moon, it began as a story of three brothers, but like with women everywhere, these two women took over. They captured the story, and they are the heart of the story. In any conflict, in any area of turbulence, I feel women are at the front line. Women are hit incredibly brutally by turbulence. And the women in this novel are rooted, they are more steadfast when it comes to their principles, and they certainly exercise a lot more compassion. But women are not at the front lines. Women's voices are secondary, and it's not just in Pakistan. Wherever we are in the world, as Bianca was saying, even in the West, we find that it's acceptable to have numbers of violence against women in the hundreds of thousands. It's acceptable to have inequality. It's acceptable to have this sort of oppression when it comes to women. But this is changing. This is changing all over the world, and certainly in Pakistan too.
One of the things that's interesting about your novel is that Samara, who is tough, she's educated, she has to fight for her education, but she doesn't want to leave.
No.
The brother, one of the brothers does. He wants to escape and get away and find a larger life. She doesn't. And it is a question, I think, for a Western reader, is why? Why do you want to stay in a place that is so contains you so?
Well, it's the notion of home. And I think, certainly there is an idea amongst young people today that there is no need for allegiance or loyalty or roots anywhere in a globalized world where we're all connected. There's nowhere that's not accessible to us. But certainly when you are struggling for something, as Samara is, that is beyond yourself, the place is important. The sense of belonging is important. For Pakistani women, in order to fight for the rights of women, they have to struggle and sacrifice themselves, and I think that's what she does, and she cannot do it outside her home.
It's a novel full of strong characters. I wouldn't say it's hopeful. Because one of the problems in the novel is that there seems to be no right choice. This is a situation in which anything you do is going to have terrible consequences.
Well, Pakistan has become a country of sacrifices now. It's a country that demands a sacrifice either of you. It will sacrifice you, or you will be forced to sacrifice someone else. I think there are certainly hopeful moments in the book. The character of Mina, to me, is very hopeful, in especially the way that she speaks against violence and doesn't distinguish between who uses it. I think the message that violence can never be employed, that once you engage in violence, you lose all ground, is I don't know if it's hopeful, but it's certainly necessary. But I don't know, Bianca. I'm hopeful when it comes to women, even though they are treated with such severity in Pakistan, as we've seen with the case of
I am
Malala.
hopeful because I feel that at last, I feel that women are joined together, that we realize, that we understand that we cannot accept what is happening, violence against women and girls and the culture of impunity without us really standing up for. But one thing that you said that really, that I have struggled throughout my life is the issue of a revolution, an armed revolution. Do they ever accomplish what they set out to do, or do they always, in the end, betray the very ideals that they fought for? And I think about, the revolution, the French Revolution, of course, and then I think about the revolution in Nicaragua, and I read, that in your book, and I'm someone who speaks always about non-violence, but then there are times when I think, is it justified that people should take arms?
Well, I think that's one of the questions of the book. Is it a question of who uses violence? Does it become acceptable if the right people or if the right causes are upheld by violence? And in my view, no. In my view, any time you engage in violence, you destroy a foundation upon which...
But then I ask myself, then what about the Holocaust? Should we not, in that case, have fought, to stop the Germans?
Well, I always think, and
Nazi?
coming back to Howard's point, I think if you look at the case of Mahatma Gandhi, to bring down an empire, but to do it with the notion of compassion, and to do it with the notion of seeking harmony over retribution, is not easy. It's a harder struggle.
And do you see any prospect, though, of some kind of a Pakistani equivalent of the Arab Spring? Because, again, your novel seems to suggest that too often the choices are made for violence, or...
Yes, and I think that Arab Spring has been deeply compromised by violence, especially on the behalf of these young people who are coming out against violent regimes. No, my hope is for non-violence. I've lived in a country that has been made of violence. My generation of Pakistanis.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm asking is how forlorn do you think that hope is?
I always have hope in people, and I think when you look at women, or you look at the struggles of minorities or of people who are disenfranchised in Pakistan, the taking of arms doesn't further their causes. It's this notion of compassion, of togetherness, of connectedness.
I just want to bring all of you in. I mean, we were reading over the weekend about the Central African Republic, appalling crimes going on right now. Some people are talking about it as genocide, a loaded word, I know, for you, Stephen Hopgood. But I wonder whether anybody feels that there are some crimes that just demand, the right to protect. So the right to protect is...
Well, one of the things you would think would trigger the right to protect would be the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. But in fact, the way a political deal was stitched up around Assad's use of chemical weapons strengthened his position in Syria rather than weakened it. So morally, there's a really strong case to be made for intervention if anything like what happened in Cambodia or Rwanda is suspected. But there are all sorts of caveats about the likelihood of greater costs, and of course it's a very political decision.
Howard Brenton?
I'd just like to go back to a scene in your book, Fatima, which I thought was a brilliant scene, an extraordinary passage, where Mina, who is a disturbed woman, she's been going to funerals that are not to do with her family and bothering people at funerals, faces down armed militia who are going to kill her and her husband.
Yeah.
And she faces them down by screaming, I think, the word justice.
Yeah.
And she just becomes so difficult that they back off.
Yeah.
I think that the point is the people in the car, she and her husband, are Shia, and they are Sunni militia.
Yes,
but
right.
they're so embarrassed by a woman screaming justice at them that they let them go. I thought that was the most terrific story, and it's a kind of story to tell. You see, it's just these little pinpricks that artists can make in this terrible world. You know, that is a beautiful pinprick.
Well, it's certainly,
don't you think? And it expresses what we've been talking about grassroots activism or response, just in that little story.
Well, justice is fundamental, I think, to any movement, any movement at all. It's certainly when we see people take up arms, when we see people in Pakistan come forward to speak against drone strikes, to speak against this sort of war on terror that has disappeared thousands of people. They are seeking justice. They are not seeking something terrible or something unusual or unidentifiable. It's justice.
But it's interesting in your book. It's an abstraction which doesn't have any legal definition. You know, it has no legal apparatus to back it up. But
the point is the militia know what she means.
Exactly,
they know what she means. In the end, we know good and evil. In the end, we do. I'm not getting into a religious metaphysical discussion, but we do know it.
Absolutely.
And the militia know it in that scene.
Unfortunately, we don't always share exactly the same definition. That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I feel what you're saying, but it is true that sometimes people think that what we think is evil is good.
But more and more there is a consensus in the world of what is, what the laws should be and applied and how they should be applied.
And do you think that's as a result of human rights campaigning?
Well, I think it's as a result of discussing it, of human rights organizations, of people throughout the world. I think what we need to come together is to understand each other's culture. But I return again to that concept of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is universal. They are things that are enshrined in law that cannot be questioned.
Do you agree there's a growing consensus? Because I don't think I
don't agree there's a growing consensus really at all. That idea of the humanist individual at the centre of Western culture, which you can see in many places, I think that's part of what is now being questioned and critiqued in many places. There are so many ways people live their lives.
But don't you think that what is being questioned is our double standards?
That's part of it.
I think that it's not the concept of universal, human right, but is our double standards. Why do we have one standards for the developed world and one stand for the developing world? Why do we, bring to the ICC, leaders because they commit terrible crimes, and then we have a George Bush? And why is it that, for example, here we have never questioned what Tony Blair did, during the Iraq War? Those are the things that people say.
Here in this program,
here in this
generally,
country.
I think it has been questioned.
It has been questioned, but more seriously, not just questioned. I'm talking about holding accountable, and that is what the developing world. Remember, I was born in Nicaragua. I have one foot in the developing world and one foot in the developed world. And I really feel deeply for the grievances of people in the developing world. But that doesn't mean that we have to just scrap everything and say, no, it doesn't work. And yes, they have failed.
Just quickly. But one of the fastest growing social movements in the world are various conservative religious movements. And it's not obvious they have a conception of the humanist self. They have very particular cultural and moral norms that they're seeking to advance.
But wouldn't do you agree that as well they are deformed? They have deformed their own religion, that they're not really talking about that.
I want to turn to another area where religious conservatism caused huge problems. The subject of your play, Howard Brenton, drawing the line, which is essentially partition, the moment at which India separates into India and Pakistan and the British leave, and done with great haste. This terrible task of drawing a line between these two non-existent countries and bringing them into existence is done over a period of 6 weeks with great scramble. Tell us about it, and why did you want to write a play about it?
I've recently written plays out of an interest in leadership in crisis, really. I wrote about Cromwell's difficulty with his fellow Republicans in bringing the King Charles I, to trial. I wrote a play about Harold Macmillan at the National Theatre because I was interested in the way he lost touch with the country. And I even I wrote a play about Ai Weiwei. We haven't talked about Chinese rights, a democratic movement. We should have perhaps in this discussion. Anyway, but in that play, although it was based on a verbatim account of his imprisonment, I put in two scenes about the Chinese leadership trying to deal with him. And it's a subject that really interests me. And I went to India as a tourist, for the first time. Went round the north, the Golden Triangle, and then my wife and I wandered around Kerala for a couple of weeks. And I kept on just meeting people who would say, my grandfather's house in Lahore, I still have the keys. A shopkeeper selling cloth in Kerala talked to me about his family in Kashmir who are actually making the goods in his So and I came to then I said, well, who drew the line? And the answer was extraordinary.
Just tell us what it was.
The answer was that Clement Attlee in 1947 sent a judge, Cyril Radcliffe, who knew nothing about India, never been to India, and who knew nothing about maps.
For Attlee, that was his qualification,
in 6
wasn't it?
weeks.
He wanted a man. He wanted a man of pure ignorance to go and.
He wanted a man with a good mind to go and cut the Gordian knot, because for the year before, a commission had been trying to draw a line and making a real mess of it, and the suspicion had overcome the Hindu, Sikh and Muslim parties, and the negotiations had broken down. And the truth, so often in these things, the truth was that Britain was bankrupt. They couldn't afford India anymore. It wasn't making the empire money anymore. So they said, let's get out.
Was Attlee a bit embarrassed by empire too? That he wasn't... I mean, it's interesting in your play. You have people who... Cyril Radcliffe, for example, continues this notion of an imperial duty to do the right thing. He goes out with good intentions. Attlee, you feel, just wants to get it off his hands as fast as possible.
I think Attlee thought we must get this off our hands. And he also, I think, as a socialist, thought we have to end decolonisation. How do you do it? There is no easy way.
You talk about it as a Gordian knot. It's not just kind of rival religious claims and this incredibly complicated map with Muslim villages in certain areas, but you've also got Mountbatten there, whose wife is having an affair with Nehru, and this adds further to the complication that Radcliffe faces.
Yes, I came really to admire the Jinnah and Nehru. Because the play is really about them dealing with Radcliffe and the British decision to withdraw, how they deal with it, how they keep their own people in line. And the truth is they were losing control. But the British were losing control, and also the Muslim and Hindu leaderships weren't able to control their people. The riots were terrifying. The killings had begun. And so they in a way said, we will back off, let the British do it.
I got the same sense from your play, actually, as from your book, Fatima, that there were no right decisions. Mountbatten says this terrible thing at one point. He says, well, I think we might get away with 100,000 deaths. They knew there was going to be terrible bloodshed, whatever they did. That was a horrible underestimate, as it turned out. But they just knew people were going to die, whatever they did.
Well, there is no... If in the history is ifs, if in the 1930s Jinnah didn't want partition until 1937, and if the British had dealt before then, perhaps you'd have been able to have a solution. But the British, in a way, weren't up to it, and they didn't like Gandhi because, Gandhi's early leadership was so brilliant. in that he did things that we've been talking about. It was a non-violent, incredible protests
but
that he was able to organise.
He rather abdicates at this point, doesn't he? He's begged to come and help with the process and minimise the violence, and he doesn't.
Well, he was always against partition. He could not bear the very idea of India being torn apart. So, in a way, he withdrew.
I didn't know that Gandhi abdicates because he fasted. He spoke very passionately against the violence, and was in Calcutta during the riots.
Yes, he toured Calcutta after terrible riots in '46.
But he's begged, isn't he, to speak for the settlement, for separation, and refuses to do it.
But he won't. No.
But you get the feeling, I got the feeling, certainly, that if he'd compromised on his principles, less people might have died.
Oh.
I mean, it's a big if.
I mean, I began almost to wonder, was he right? Yeah.
Was he right? Do you not think at any point, actually, there might have been just a case for the British staying on a bit longer?
No, I didn't.
No.
But it is an interesting example where a degree of hypocrisy gets you. It just leads to more bloodshed in the end.
OK, well, we're just going to have to stay on a degree of hypocrisy. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you to all of my guests. Bianca Jagger's Longford lecture can be read online. There's a link on our website for Start the Week. Fatima Bhutto's The Shadow of the Crescent Moon and Stephen Hopgood's The Endtimes of Human Rights are both out now. And you can see Howard Brenton's new play, Drawing the Line, at the Hampstead Theatre from the 3rd of December. Next week, Bridget Kendall discusses the look and smell of our urban landscape with Patrick Keeler, Robin Robertson, Victoria Henshaw and Giles Fraser. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Third Millennium Development Goal target is to promote gender equality and empower women. Doesn't that cover what you're...
Well, in the Millennium Development Goals that they set out in the year 2000, they left out ending violence against women, and UN Women calls that the missing Millennium Development Goal. And I've been...
And that's not... But why is that not covered by gender equality and empowerment?
Well, because that's something else. It's not one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals that is covered, but it's not specific to the Millennium Development Goals, and therefore I was quite shocked to find that they didn't think that was an important target, and that they are discussing that they will introduce it in 2015. But I feel that we have no time to wait for another 2 years. And, many people think that violence against women is an issue that concerned only the developing world. But that is not so. And I tried to explain that in my lecture, because the numbers in this country, for example, 400,000 women suffer sexual assault. There were 60,000 rapes in the UK last year. Only 1 in 10 women are prepared to denounce the rapes, and only over 5,000 were prosecuted. That means that even if we have laws, that those laws are not enforced, and that something is wrong, even in the developed world.
I mean, is your point as well that unless you solve this problem first, you're not going to be able to solve the other?
Well, my point is that if we don't solve this, then many of those targets, that will not be able to develop, particularly when we talk about development, and that is such an important issue. And why is it that at this stage in the 21st century, after so many years, we're still dealing with these horrendous numbers of women that have been raped, of women that have been victims of sexual assault, of women that have been killed by the partner? This morning I was listening to the numbers of women that were killed last year in the UK by the partners. I mean, it is unthinkable, but it is unspoken, underhanded, but they still believe that women are inferior.
You're very persuasive about the fact that something has to be done. Your lecture is depressing, which might sound like an insult, but it's meant to be depressing. It's a litany of terrible statistics. It's less clear what we do about it.
What I did in my speech is that I call upon women to declare a non-violence revolution. But I didn't only call upon women to declare a non-violence revolution to achieve this, but I call upon men as well, because we cannot achieve the ending violence against women and girls and the culture of impunity unless men are prepared to join in with us in this struggle.
Stephen Hopgood, I want to bring you in now, because your book, The Endtimes of Human Rights, is very specifically about some of these issues and about the practicality of applying a universal set of values, a universal notion of human rights for women to very different societies. I mean, I wonder, are you essentially saying that Bianca is wasting her time in this enterprise?
I don't think she's necessarily wasting her time, but I agree with much of her analysis. What I am is more sceptical than she is that human rights are going to be an effective mechanism for making change happen. If you look globally, it seems to me there's pushback from the religious organisations you mentioned, authoritarian nationalism. My central point is that the sort of Western powers which have supported the international human rights regime for, in some ways, 150 years are declining in their influence. And so a new settlement will have to be achieved, and it's not going to be good news for the hard cases, women's rights, sexuality rights, children's rights in many, many parts of the world.
You make a distinction between human rights with capital letters and human rights with lowercase letters.
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
This programme has been edited since broadcast.
Hello. Sadly, it's all too obvious that human rights aren't equally enjoyed across the world. But could they ever be, or is the great missionary enterprise of the last 50 years losing its impetus in a changing world? You aren't really meant to question human rights as a concept, but Stephen Hopgood, reader in international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, has dared to in his book The Endtimes of Human Rights. Bianca Jagger will be pushing back against his scepticism, I think, as chair of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation and as a tireless campaigner for basic human rights to be recognised by governments everywhere. Also with us, offering another take on the perpetual friction between local and global values, the writer Fatima Bhutto, whose novel The Shadow of the Crescent is set in a troubled region of Pakistan, and Howard Brenton, whose new play is about one of the reasons it ended up so troubled, British rule in India and its messy and bloody conclusion. We start, though, with Bianca Jagger, who's just delivered this year's Longford Lecture in London, a passionate appeal for the world to take violence against women more seriously than it has done so far. Bianca, your lecture is subtitled Achieving the Missing Millennium Development Goal Target. Why missing? There is the third, what practical action can you take beyond calling for action?
Well, in fact, the lecture may be that that you saw was the one that I gave at Oxford University and that I gave in America. But the one I gave at the Longford Lecture, I did give some examples of my vision and what we can do and why it is so important to have this legal mechanism to be able to make a difference. And they are, we need to reform the laws, and then I went in details about some of the laws that we need to reform. We need, of course, to engage governments. We need to engage the police. We need to engage, NGOs. We need to engage as well the religious leaders. Because
you run into a problem, though, don't you, almost immediately? I mean, the 2013 Commission on the Status of Women, Russia, the Vatican and the Muslim Brotherhood came together in this unlikely alliance to block certain statements.
And that is what is so scary. And then I hope that perhaps now, with our new Pope, that things will be a bit different for the Catholic Church.
But you are reliant on goodwill, as it were, because what else do you have to trump that resistance?
Well, unfortunately, all we have is the goodwill, but